let's say your sales drop 5%, you're going to see your profitability drop 15, 20, sometimes 25%, 3, 4, 5x what your sales decline is. And that's where I think people get in trouble.
Welcome back to the BodyShop Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Barkholder, and today I'm really excited about this conversation. We talk a lot on this show about operations, culture, and leadership, but we don't talk enough about the financial side of running a shop. And that's exactly why I brought in today's guest. Doug Higgins is a former Fortune 100 finance executive who made the leap into collision repair. And he didn't just consult from the sidelines, he ran both a collision MSO and an ADOS calibration company at the same time under the TAG umbrella. Today, he's the founder of Collision Advisory, a fractional CFO practice built specifically for collision repair operators. Doug, welcome to the BodyShop Leaders Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
I really appreciate you coming on. It's my pleasure to have you here. So Doug, we're going to just dive right in. We're going to have a great conversation. Let's go right back to the beginning. You spent over a decade at Kroger in some pretty high-level finance roles. What was that world like, and what made you decide to leave the Fortune 100 career behind?
Yeah, so look, the work at Kroger was awesome. I had so many people that shaped how I think about business and life in some cases. At the end of the day, for me, I got to a sort of a fork in the road where I felt like I was living in a place where my decisions were really far away from where the customer actually was. And so the work that I was doing around M&A and strategic planning at the corporate level, when I had this opportunity to get into collision repair, I felt like it was an opportunity for me to now bring that level of decision making down to, in this case, a shop floor where, real impact happens. And I just wanted to be closer to where I felt like every day I would make a decision or I would do something and there would be an outcome, because that's not always the case, and especially not at a large organization like Kroger. So it was a natural flow for me. I've always been kind of an operator, and so it felt like an easy decision for me at that point in time.
Amazing. It feels to me like that would have been a huge jump, but I think you're handling it well, obviously.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I was terrified, right? I mean, there is a lot of comfort in, working within a large organization. And now I'm living in an entrepreneurial setting like most of my clients. And, you don't always sleep that well, when you're worried about your business. And I see the pain that a lot of shop owners are going through right now. And I now feel that quite a bit because there is no safety net. And so, yeah, it was scary jumping down. And then now this most recent leap is even scarier. But I think it positions me well to really help my clients because I understand how they feel, on a daily basis.
Right. That makes sense. That kind of leads me right into my next question. When you first made that step from corporate into the collision repair world, what was something that surprised you the most? And potentially, what did the corporate world not prepare you for in this smaller collision repair world?
Well, I think one of the things that happens to any of us in life or in work is we tend to see the world as like the bubble that we live in, right? And so I lived in this corporate bubble for so long. I just assumed that everybody saw the financials the same way that I did. And now I did understand that, having worked with store operators in the case of grocery, I did understand that there was a financial gap. But what I was most surprised by, I think, was when I started seeing that the gap was much larger than I anticipated. I knew there was going to be some, but I did not realize how big of a gap it was. And I don't think it's special to collision repair, by the way. I think this is the case with most small businesses and most of the lower middle market. And so for me, I think that was the most surprising thing. And it shouldn't have been, but we all live in our bubble. And then when we step out of it, we're surprised by it. And so that was
Right.
it for me. I was like, oh, wow, there's like people that don't get it and don't understand this financial side. And then
Right.
that's really how it developed over the last several years. I started seeing those gaps everywhere in every conversation I had. And I was like, oh, okay. So that's how it is in the lower middle market, in the small business world, small, medium business world. I can help people because I can help close that gap. And so that's really, I think that was the biggest surprise for me. I think the other thing was I was used to, in the world that I lived in, it was like within 5 or 6 or 10 days of the end of the month or a quarter or whatever, we would have financials to look at. And in this world, again, not special to collision repair, I think it's this way in all the small, medium business world. It's oftentimes 30 days before you see anything that you can react to from prior month. And so again, that's the big opportunity in this space, is to try to close that gap, because the tighter that gap is, the better decisions you're going to make because you have better information to make them from.
Right. That is a really good point about that, closing that gap, especially around the timeline, so you can make a better decision. Let's talk a little bit more, Doug, about how you went from running the numbers at a 2 billion, and that's with a B, Kroger division, to dealing with insurance reimbursements, parts delays. Was there a defining moment when you thought, boy, this industry really needs better financial leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could point to a specific like aha moment. They just piled up over time, right? It's hard because it's like I don't want to call anybody out, right? And that there's no,
Right.
it's difficult to separate what I saw in the larger market versus what I saw, locally. But to me, I think the biggest thing is when I realized that I'm used to looking forward. Like, it's just the way I am. I like looking like around the corner and down the road and saying like, okay, this is kind of what could happen or what I should be preparing for, if that makes sense. And so I was used to that. That's not the way most people operate in general. And it's certainly not the way most people operate in the collision space or even in the small, medium business market. So for me, that was, I think, when I could see that everyone around me was making decisions based on backward looking information, and they were unable to take that backward looking information and then point it forward and say, okay, how do I now make a decision, and how do I forecast, and how do I build a plan that I can react to, that can be malleable and flexible, and try to build something that I can change and adjust over time based on new inputs, and make that thing a living organism, right? And make it part of your business and part of your decision making process. And so I think for me, to answer your question, I think perhaps that was the defining moment when I realized that everybody was looking back and I was looking forward, and I could take all these people and be like, hey, just turn your head around, look this way, and let's start making decisions based on where we're going, not where we were. And I think that's another thing that people really struggle with, is they don't realize when they've gotten to a point where the things that got them to where they are today won't get them to where they want to be. Right. And you hear people say that a lot. They're like, oh, but it's true. I think a lot of entrepreneurs, not special to collision, will double down on the things that got them to where they are, thinking that it will propel them forward, and it often doesn't, right? And so
Right.
I think those were a couple of things that I recognized pretty quickly as being opportunities for a lot of people in this space.
I love that idea of, rather than looking in the rearview mirror trying to guide the car, let's turn around and let's look out the windshield and actually see where we're going and make decisions based off of that. That's awesome. So, Doug, you founded Collision Advisory as a fractional CFO practice specifically for collision shops. Now, for a collision shop owner who hears fractional CFO and aren't sure what that means, What does working with you actually look like day to day?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, look, a fractional CO is not a bookkeeper. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get that out of the way.
Right.
Typically, what I bring to the table is I'm a leader, I'm a finance leader, and working with me means you get part of me, part of my time without the full time cost of what I bring to the table. And so I think that's really the way to think about it. Every engagement that I have right now looks a little bit different, and it depends on what that particular owner needs. Some of my clients have really a need for just kind of small touch here and there, right? They need a monthly deliverable around, their closing review that an owner can read. Or I've written a lot about this on LinkedIn, but like having a cash flow forecast or a KPI dashboard. Some of these things are small. Others need a lot of help on the M&A side. And with my M&A background, it's easy for me to kind of slot in there and say, hey, these are the things I would look for when you're looking to acquire or when you're evaluating an opportunity or building a strategy around acquisition and building over time. And also too, because of my M&A background, I can help strategically position some of these people for exit at some point, right? And that's a valuable thing that I can bring to the table for a lot of shop owners. Others are they don't have the financial infrastructure and they need help building that infrastructure. And so I say I'm not a bookkeeper, but I know how to do it. And so I can often jump in with an accounting team that exists and try to level them up and get them to a point where they can really do a lot of that stuff that I just described themselves under sort of my guidance and my leadership. And so that's another way that this kind of manifests as well. So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, right, a full time CFO will run anywhere between 150 and 200K a year. And most shops can't afford that, nor should they. In fact, I would argue, and I've worked with a lot of large, I say large, but I mean larger independent MSOs. It doesn't make any sense, in my opinion, for most of the independent body shop businesses that I'm aware of to have a full-time CFO. There's only really a couple I can think of, and they have full-time CFOs, and that's right for them. I'm not certain it makes sense for most of this market to have that kind of guidance. So, yeah, at the end of the day, I've really tried to position this thing as I'm trying to help give people the financial clarity to make better decisions and prep for whatever outcome they want for themselves over whatever time period they want it. And whatever that looks like, I'll position myself to fill that need.
Amazing. So a part-time financial leader is
Yeah.
really kind of what I heard you say.
Yeah,
That
I like that. And you know what else, too, I would say, Daniel, is, and I've said this to several people, and I think my clients would tell you this. I am a business partner. I run my own business. I understand what it means to run a business. I get a half a dozen calls a week from my clients asking me about a business decision, right? They're like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing. What do you think? Or I had this conversation with this guy that I'm looking to acquire. What do you think about it? They want my advice, right? They want my advice around how to better run their business. And so I try to bring that financial lens to that decision making process. And so sometimes it means, hey, you know what? Let me build a model that we can iterate on and try to answer your question. And sometimes I've got a quick answer because I've seen it a dozen times. I'm like, I already know that one. Like, that one's easy. So we just answer it and move on.
That's awesome. So Doug, another question that I have for you, and I see you posting on LinkedIn. You do a great job on LinkedIn, but you post about EBITDA. I know that's a term that shop owners hear thrown around, especially probably when they're talking to consolidators or thinking about selling. Can you break down what adjusted EBITDA actually means for a shop owner and why it matters, even if you're not looking to sell?
So there are two terms there. One was EBITDA, and the other one was adjusted EBITDA. And those are very different. So
Explain it.
it sounds like they're not, but they're very different. So EBITDA is just the amount of earnings that your business created before, that's the B, earnings before interest, taxes, and then I don't know why they split these up. It's probably just to make it sound like a word. The D and the A are depreciation and amortization. Those are non-cash things. They don't represent any sort of cash flow item, right? It's not like you're writing a check for depreciation or amortization. So the whole goal of EBITDA is really to try to get to a cash number that the business is producing on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis before you have to pay your interest on your loans or your taxes on the business or any of that sort of stuff. And what that does is the reason people use EBITDA is because they're trying to create a comparable number to another business so they can evaluate how that business looks compared to another one, right? So that's the whole point of financial analysis in general is like it's a scoreboard, it's a scorecard of sorts. And so EBITDA becomes this sort of metric where you can evaluate one business versus another and score yourself compared to somebody else. And then from a buyer's standpoint, right, they're going to look at that EBITDA and they're going to say, okay, how do they compare to somebody else? Well, what's in that EBITDA? And that's one of the questions that a buyer will ask is they'll say, well, are those Warriors tickets, or you're an Oklahoma guy, the Oklahoma Thunder floor seats, are those in your EBITDA number? Well, we need to add those back because when I buy the business from you, we're not going to have those on the business. So that becomes an add back. Or maybe your truck or the boat slip is on your business. Okay, well, we need to add some of those things back because they're not going to be on the business when I acquire it from you. And so that's where you get to adjusted EBITDA. And all they're trying to do is an acquirer or somebody that's trying to buy your business. They're just trying to add back those things so that they can now compare you to your quote unquote standard sort of collision business, right? Because they're probably operating collision businesses and they know what good looks like. And so they just want to be able to compare yours to the portfolio that they have or whatever they think it should look like. And then that helps them value your business at that point. And usually that adjusted EBITDA becomes the number because people like to talk about multiples. And usually that adjusted EBITDA becomes the number that you multiply by to get to the value of the business, like what I'm going to pay for your business.
Interesting. Wow, I'm glad you understand that because a lot of that's over my head.
I don't even know if I explained it very well. I hope I did.
You did.
The point is,
Yes.
it's just a scorecard number. And of course, I help all my clients understand where they're at and how they
Right.
compare. There's 15, 20 pieces inside of your EBITDA number, right, that determine what your EBITDA is. And
Right.
that's a thing that I spend a lot of time on with my clients is, hey, what are the levers we need to pull within your business to try to get that EBITDA number so that it's
Right.
one of the better ones or at least comparable to make it attractive to a buyer.
That's awesome. No, that's a good information for anybody that's listening. And I'm sure you could go down a rabbit hole and spend the next 2 hours
Ah,
explaining it to us all more in depth. Let's talk a little bit about cash flow.
okay.
Cash flow seems to be one of the biggest pain points in this industry. Like, as you know, insurance payments come in late, parts costs are always going up. What's the number one cash flow mistake that you see shop owners making, and what's the fix to that?
I see two mistakes probably made most often. One is confusing profit with cash flow. Now, I just said earlier, like the goal of trying to get to EBITDA is trying to get to sort of a cash flow number that the business is throwing off every month, but that's not always the case. So EBITDA doesn't have things like owner draws. It doesn't have things like a frame rack, or maybe you've bought some ADAS equipment. Those things aren't in your EBITDA. Those are actually what you would call a cash flow item. So you wrote a check for those things, but they don't show up in your EBITDA. So there's a gap there that a finance person understands. And honestly, most people understand this intuitively because they're usually operating from a bank account, which is probably maybe right alongside of what I just said is maybe the other number one thing I see people making a mistake of is they try to operate from their bank account. And that's a really difficult thing to do. And it goes both ways. Some people operate from a bank account and they leave too much cash in the business and it's unproductive. And then I see other people operate from a bank account and it goes the other way. So, but that's probably the number one mistake is they just don't understand the gap between their P&L and cash flow. And so getting that visibility is probably the number one thing that I try to help my clients with is I try to give them that visibility and then point them, like we said a minute ago, down the road and say, hey, you typically do this every March and you invest this much in equipment. We should plan for that and make sure we've got enough cash in
Right.
reserve. Oh, hey, by the way, you need to take a draw out because you owe taxes in April, right? You got to write a check for your taxes. Okay, let's build that into a forward looking cash flow model so that you're not surprised when that tax bill comes and you're scrambling all of a sudden to make that work. So I think to me, it's just a lack of clarity and visibility. And it's a combination of all those things that we just talked about. And then also making it forward looking is a mistake that I see happen a lot. They look at the cash that happened and they assume that that's the way the cash is going to go going forward. Maybe, maybe not. What are the 10 things that caused that cash to look that way? And are those going to continue to look that way over the next, 13 weeks or 6 months or whatever? And so understanding all those variables gets you to a better outcome.
Great explanation. I think to be able to do that, to, like you said, basically just take that data from the back and pivot it to the front so we can determine and make sure we have that correct cash flow. Now, there's another term that you use, Doug, and I don't even know if I understand it, so I'm interested to hear what you say about this one. You talk about burn rate. Now, people might associate that term with startups, not with body shops. And what does this mean in our collision context, and how do you help owners figure out theirs?
So I want to be clear on this one because I'm not entirely sure that I was the one that coined burn rate as it relates to body shops. I think I have seen that around a little bit lately. And I agree with you actually in that I don't think it's an appropriate term for the collision space. I think to be honest with you, you're right. Burn rate is typically associated with startups, it's associated with SaaS companies, venture sort of vocabulary. Now, what I do think is important for body shop owners to understand is I think they need to understand what their fixed costs are and what their variable costs are. And that's where I think a lot of shops get themselves into trouble is they don't understand what's truly fixed within their business. And so when sales go down, those fixed costs stay the same and the variable costs will change as your sales go down or up or whatever. And so one of the interesting things here is Daniel, and I was just having this conversation yesterday with a shop owner that and I said, we were talking about the fact that I think, and I saw it happen, I think a lot of shop owners over the last, call it 5, 6, 7 years, have optimized their operation for an environment where sales are going up. And so, an environment when sales are going up, you actually do want to try to fix your costs if you can. So, for example, a lot of folks went salary or hourly on their body techs or their refinish techs, like the techs on the shop floor. So, that's great, sort of, in an environment when sales are going up, right? Because your fixed costs stay the same, your revenue increases, and you now are more profitable. The only problem is when sales now go the other way, those fixed costs are stuck. And I watch this happen. You see those sales go down, those fixed costs stay the same, and your profitability drop is 2 to 3 times worse than your sales drop. Let's say your sales drop 5%, you're going to see your profitability drop 15, 20, sometimes 25%, 3, 4, 5x what your sales decline is. And that's where I think people get in trouble. And so, I mean, do I want to say you don't want to use burn rate? I just think it gets confusing. But at the end of the day, you're not wrong. You are burning a certain amount of cash every month on fixed costs. And so you do want to try to optimize your model to be, in my opinion, I like to build it so that it's all weather, right? You want to build an all weather company that can weather the ups and the downs. And so you kind of want to optimize that fixed and variable cost structure to make it so that you're optimized for the good and the bad times. And so I think there have been some shop owners that have been really savvy and have been able to sort of weather the current storm because they've built a lot of variable cost into their structure. And as sales have come down, they haven't, been hit as hard from a profitability standpoint.
That's a great point. And I think the takeaway that I take away from this is ensure that you really have a good handle on what your fixed costs and what your variable costs are, and then try to keep those in tandem, obviously, with your sales.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Awesome.
Yep.
Good stuff. Let's move on, Doug, to another question that I have. So you have a really unique experience running both Tag Auto Group on the collision MSO side and then also Tag Calibrations on the ADOS side at the same time. How did operating both of those businesses shape the way you think about shop economics? And also, what should owners be thinking about when it comes to ADOS calibration and potentially opportunities around that?
Great question. I don't know when this will air, but I'm in the middle of sort of a month where I'm only talking about ADOS economics right now. And
Nice.
so the month of May is dedicated right now to helping shop owners think through exactly this problem. The headline here is that, calibration revenue is at a high gross margin. And they're right. That's a true statement. I think what I've seen is that the shop floor reality is the calibration only happens if the shop captures the work. And one of the things that I'm trying to drive home is optimize your capture first, and then you can start having different conversations about what to invest in and when. And I think a lot of shop owners have gotten into this sort of like fear of, oh, if I don't do it, I'm going to miss out. And don't operate from a place of fear, first of all, because it's never a good place to operate from. Try to look around the corner, like we said earlier. And I'm trying to help shops do that right now by saying, okay, where am I at today? And what levers can I pull right now to optimize the operation that I have today? In many cases, shops are subletting this, which I think is fine for a lot of shops. But I think unless you're optimizing for getting every single vehicle that needs a calibration to have a calibration, then no amount of equipment spend or training or any of that other stuff around performing the calibrations is going to do anything. It's not going to be as good as if you were capturing every item. Now, I will say, though, I've seen, and we saw this when I was in the operation, when we were giving someone in the operation the baton on, hey, your job is to find and calibrate every single vehicle we possibly can. When we gave that ownership to someone, our capture rate went like that. It just immediately, it was like, oh man, yeah, because they own that, and it created some tension with everybody else in the shop that maybe wasn't as focused on that. So I saw that when people were able to give that some focus, they were able to make a lot of progress. But as with all things, what do they say? You manage what you measure. And so again, like part of my series right now is really about measuring the right things. And in my opinion, the very first thing is what percentage of vehicles that you're repairing today are receiving a calibration, and making sure you're calculating that every month and understanding what I'm calling a penetration rate is. Compare yourself to the rest of the market, because there are numbers out there to do that. And then that gives you the ammo, if you will, to now make better decisions about whether you should continue to sublet, or maybe you partner with somebody else that can help you bring some of this in house. Maybe you eventually bring it all in house and you maybe even become a sublet vendor for, folks in your market. So actually, Rev has done a really good job with this. I just saw this last week. They actually have like sort of a maturity curve, like a 5 stages. And I have a post coming out about this week, but kind of evaluating where you are on the curve and then figuring out how you move yourself down that curve or along that curve and when it makes sense to do so. So I'm going to drop something at the end of May that will be an economics sort of playbook for people to plug and play and say, okay, this is where I'm at today. This is where I think I should be. This is when the decision to bring it in house makes sense and that sort of thing. So hopefully help a lot of shop owners think through that decision making process.
Like that. That's a very thoughtful way to make the decision rather than just kind of like gut feel like, oh, well, I think we're calibrating enough to bring it in house. No, let's actually look at the data. Let's have somebody own this thing, and then we can make a decision based on those numbers.
Yep.
Very thoughtful advice. Doug, there's a lot of talk about shop valuations, and I would like to hear you speak into this some. People saying shops are selling for 7x, and if I understand correctly, you push back on that. What's the real story with collision repair evaluations right now, and what should an owner be thinking about if they're considering a sale?
Well, yeah, this is a loaded topic. I'm probably going to walk into some
Into
landmines,
a
which is fine.
landmine.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think it was Focus Advisors that did a study fairly recently about valuations, the multiple, right? And I think everybody understands this. And I said it earlier, you're multiplying whatever the multiple is by probably your adjusted EBITDA. There's some question about whether it's your adjusted or it's your actual, depends on the buyer. And so, but anyway, more often than not, it's you take that multiple, let's say it's 7, and you're multiplying it by your adjusted EBITDA to get your approximated valuation for your business. For me, I think the value or that multiple, that number tends to be bait, in my opinion. And I think a lot of shop owners get hyper obsessed with a number. And I understand why. I get it. Like, I understand the reason behind it. And the reason is because they want to understand what the value of their company is so that they can plan for an eventual exit. And they know then, okay, if I sell today, it's worth this and I can walk away and be independent. Like I can be financially independent for X number of years and retire and do all that stuff. That's good, right? That's what I'm talking about when you're like forward planning. The trap that I think a lot of people fall into is sometimes they get hooked on either a multiple or they get hooked on like, they're like, oh, well, I heard it was this and it was a multiple of revenue instead of a multiple of EBITDA. And it was what happens is I see owners get fixated on a number and then they make bad decisions because they've now gotten themselves into this thought pattern about what they think their business is worth. I'm sorry to tell you, the business is worth whatever somebody is willing to pay for it. And so
Right.
that's where I think that there's a huge gap is some people are still thinking that their business is worth what it was 2 or 3 years ago. It actually has nothing to do with the multiple. In fact, Focus Advisors is saying the multiple hasn't changed in like 2 or 3, 4 years. It's been the same for, however many years. And I think they're saying it's about 7-ish. Okay. That's fine. But to me, I think it's a valuable exercise. But I think the more important question is, why are you worth that? And that's what I think a lot of people don't think through. They think, well, I'm worth 7x and that's that. Well, okay, but why are you worth 7x? And that's the part that I'm pushing back on is, do you have clean financials every month? If you walk as an owner, if you walk out of the business today, is your business still going to run? Because if the answer is no, then you're probably not going to get a premium multiple because whoever's buying that from you knows that they're going to have to put somebody else in that can do all the stuff that you're involved in. So one of the things that a really savvy owner will do is they will get themselves out of a lot of the decision making process in their business, because that makes your business worth more than it is to somebody that isn't doing that. And so that's another mistake I see people make, is they get involved in too many things that they shouldn't be involved in, instead of empowering their team to make decisions that they would largely make. So I think that's a big thing. And then I think the other question that I don't see enough owners thinking through is, how do I optimize this whole thing for that, if whatever outcome it is that I want? Because the answer is different depending on who you're trying to sell to. So let's say you're trying to sell to a Caliber or a Gerber or somebody. Well, they don't need a CFO, they don't need a controller, they don't need a lot of this stuff. Those all actually become add backs to get to an adjusted EBITDA number for that type of buyer. Okay. So that's what you would call like a strategic buyer. A financial buyer is a little bit different, because a financial buyer is typically a private equity group, and they're going to come in and they're going to say, hey, you operate in a really attractive market for us, because we can see, looking around you, that there's 100 shops that we could probably buy and bolt on to your operation. So let's say your operation is 4 or 5 shops. You, in that case, you're actually going to get a premium multiple, because you're a platform. So you're a platform upon which you're going to stack other shops, right? And so in that case, you need a CFO, or maybe a me in the short run, right? But you need somebody that can help you run your financials on a monthly basis. You might need a marketing person. So having a leadership team is worth a little bit more, and a buyer might be willing to pay a higher multiple for that, because they're going to stack a bunch of shops on top going forward. So that's the thing that I think people don't think through. They get fixated on one number and they multiply it by another number and they say, that's what my business is worth. And I'm always like, well, maybe. What are you trying to optimize for? And that's what I'm trying to help people think through. And that's why I push back on the whole. It's not that 7X is wrong. It's only a piece of the story, and it just doesn't give it doesn't give it the weight that it deserves, which is a very thoughtful decision-making process about what you're building and why you're building it.
That is a masterclass there that you just gave us, Doug. I feel like anybody that's considering selling, you gave just a number of different points there of things to evaluate and consider as they're doing this. Don't just think about that 7X. There's so much more to this. It's so much bigger than that. That's awesome. So Doug, let's talk a little bit about shop owners that might be listening who know their books aren't where they need to be. Maybe they're running off a gut instinct. Maybe they're running off of a checking account. What are the first 2 or 3 things you would just kind of tell them to do this week, maybe even, to just get starting, getting a handle on their numbers?
Yeah. So one of the first things I would probably have them do on their own is go in and pull maybe your last 12 months of bank statements. And you got to be careful with this a little bit, because your data is sensitive. But if you can sanitize it a little bit, you can actually have AI help you with this, right? You can categorize some of your costs, especially if you don't have clean financials, right? Like CCC is one thing, or whatever management system you're using, if it's Mitchell or whatever, that's fine. Let's assume that that's not that clean. Let's assume that your financials aren't that clean, to your point. What I would love to see is, I'd love to see somebody go through and line item their entire bank statement for 12 months, feed that a sanitized version that isn't going to reveal any sort of personal data or any of that into an AI that can help you quickly categorize some of these costs into buckets that make it digestible. And then what I would love to see people do is, I'd love to see people go through that and say, okay, which of these costs are fixed? The earlier conversation we were having around fixed versus variable, and write out those fixed costs, right? Like rent and insurance and payroll for, admin type roles that don't change in your software. And your debt, like, because your debt payment's probably going to be in there, that's a fixed cost. And so that number becomes sort of what you have to clear every month just to break even on those fixed costs. And then you've got revenue and variable costs and some of these other things. And you can kind of see on a monthly basis, like, that's your actual cash number every month. It's right there in your bank statement, right? And so, if nothing else, and I know I'm kind of going back on what I said earlier, where I don't really want people operating from a bank statement. And that's true. I don't want that for people because it's got blinders on to the reality of the whole picture. But if nothing else, at least give yourself a good feel for whether your business is building cash and why. And then also, too, maybe call out the one-off items that really don't have anything to do with the business that maybe you can do without, right? It's like, oh,
Sure.
shoot, maybe I should think about getting rid of this thing or that thing or whatever. And AI is so awesome at this. Like, it's incredible what you can do and how quickly, because this is normally a very painful process. And so
Right.
if you can do it in a really secure way, in a sanitized way, you can get to these answers a lot faster. Now, I've been spending a lot of time with some tools that you don't have to do as much sanitation on and that keep your data in a secure way that I've been trying to help some shop owners think through, but that's for another conversation. So yeah, I mean, that would be the number one thing. The second thing I'd pull probably is your AR aging, which typically you can see in your management system if you're keeping at least good records in your management system. And then put a phone call in on the calendar to anyone that's over 60 days, not an email, right? Call the person that owes you money and get your money. This thing doesn't work if you don't have cash. Now, I have some metrics for what I like outstanding AR to look like over time. So I have some opinions on that, but that's for another conversation. So at minimum, that would be the second thing I would do. And then probably the third thing is I'm operating under the assumption that you're using a management system that lets you calculate gross profit on each job. If you're not there, then I can help you get there, but that's a whole nother type of engagement. That's more of like, hey, how do I operate within a management system that gives me the financial clarity that I need down the line, right? This is like at the shop level, trying to get some of that stuff. But let's assume that you have that. Just calculate your gross profit on each repair order over the last 50 jobs. If you're not doing that, the number might surprise you. You might be like, oh, shoot, I didn't realize I lost money on those 5 jobs. Like, man, what the heck was I doing? And what can I fix? So this sort of clarity just gives you that, I guess, that ammo to then say, all right, what do I need to focus on to avoid those situations? And how do I prioritize those focus items then at that point to get the most bang for my buck and the time that I'm going to spend on it?
It's awesome. Appreciate that very clear direction, Doug, for anybody that's listening to get on top of their numbers. And like you said, if you can sanitize the sensitive data, go ahead and use AI to help you speed up this process and get you better answers. I wouldn't say I would trust AI for my financial advice. I'd probably talk to somebody like Doug, but at least it helps get you your numbers, maybe at least in the right buckets where you can start analyzing it a little bit. So that's great advice. Let's look forward just a little bit at the industry with consolidators pressure, costs rising, technology changing. Where do you see the independent shop owner in 5 years from now?
So I have a contrarian opinion on this.
It sounds like fun.
Yeah, here's what I would say. My opinion is that I believe that independent shop owners are in maybe the most enviable position in the history. This is true for any small, medium businesses, but especially collision repair because it's so labor intensive and there's no chance of sort of being disrupted by any sort of automation, robotics, that kind of thing, for at least for in the foreseeable future. I think that operators that are savvy, and this term is going to get misconstrued, but the right operators are going to do really, really well over the next 5 years, in my opinion. And part of the reason for that is because speed is more valuable than anything right now on multiple fronts because technology is changing so fast that small to medium sized operators are going to be able to optimize for things that the big operators are. I can tell you, coming from a big company, slow, slow, slow. They're just slow. And they're always going to be that way. And so I believe these small independent operators exist at this perfect moment in time where the technology is such that if they move with speed and discernment, they can take advantage of a market that I believe is ripe for the picking. Now, not everybody will be able to take advantage of it, obviously, for any number of reasons. I also think, and this is sort of the contrarian view here, I'm not sure that this thing ends up as consolidated as everyone thinks it will. I hear this a lot where, oh, the insurers are going to make sure that, and I get it, but they're going to make sure that there's only 5 collision repair facilities. And my thing is, I come from grocery. If you think about grocery, the bigger you are, the cheaper you can buy groceries, right? And so you can pass those reduced costs along to your consumers in that case. So grocery incentivizes consolidation, right? So
Yes.
it is perfectly incentivized to make it so that there are as few operators as possible because you get what's called an economy of scale. And I won't go into that, but you get the cheapest possible groceries that way. And so the market will optimize for that. Well, go look at the market share of grocery. There's not 5 operators, there's like 25 that make up 50% of the market. I think Walmart has maybe 20%, Kroger has like 9, so I'm just not seeing that. Doesn't exist in collision. If you look at the revenue makeup of a collision operator, half of it is labor. How are you going to get an economy of scale on labor? The more labor you buy, the cheaper it is? No, that's not true, especially not in collision, right? You need really skilled workers that understand how to repair vehicles, understand ADAS. So that's not a commodity. So to me, I'm really struggling. Now, I'm not saying that the insurers won't try to build that consolidation in. I'm not saying that. Will they try? Yeah, absolutely. And the big operators will try to get there. I just don't know if it will play out that way. I think that it's more likely that we're going to have 25 and there are going to be some regional operators that are really, really strong and are able to sort of get the same advantages because they moved quickly on any number of items. I mean, you think about, you see this all the time in the marketing space. A local shop has a presence that a big operator cannot compete with. They just can't.
100%.
They can't be the local shop. They'll never be the local shop. And
Right.
so those local operators that can take advantage of a lot of the technology and use people like, Daniel Burkholder and your body shop marketing and any number of other opportunities like that allow you to take advantage of this moment. I think that there's going to be a lot of people that are surprised by how this shakes out. Now, somebody 10 years from now is going to look at this video and be like, Doug was dead wrong. And that's fine. But it's just my crystal ball. The people that know me well enough know that sometimes I like to do the crystal ball thing and I like to be like, oh, I think this is what's going to happen. And so that's where my crystal ball is pointing me right now. We'll see how it plays out. It's fun to speculate.
Yeah, I love your honest, contrarian answer. Yeah, and I'm glad that you were brave enough to share it, even though it might be a little different than what some other people think. But like you said, we'll see how it plays out. And I think you make an interesting point that I had never really thought about, that the scale of commodities versus the scale of labor is a different ball game, and that plays out differently. So that's a fascinating way to look at it from your perspective. And I think you bring a little bit of a unique perspective, probably because coming from
Yeah.
the grocery, you got to see that side of it and you bring that in, and that's how you see it here. So that's awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. Doug, we have one last question that we ask at the end of every episode. What does being a body shop leader mean to you?
Yeah, I guess to me, being a body shop leader is taking responsibility for what your people and your customers and your numbers in some cases depend on. Like you need to take responsibility for those pieces so that you can deliver a business that supports your people and your customers, right? And that numbers part is, kind of mine to help with. The people part and the customer part are the leader's job, right? And bringing in the right people into your organization to help you drive that forward. To me, I guess leadership at a body shop is not really a title. It's whether the owner shows up for the hard calls or hides their head in the sand, right? A lot of people are doing that right now where they're just burying their head in the sand. They're like, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't want to deal with all this. It's too many variables. And I think the people that are brave enough to stand up are the ones that are the leaders. And
Right.
those hard calls are usually, so let's be honest, right? The hard calls are usually about money, people, or relationships in your market. And I think they're usually the ones that those hard calls are the ones that the owner has been avoiding for 6 months or a year or whatever. So to me, I think that being a body shop leader means facing those difficult challenges and doing the things that you don't want to do. Because that's really what it comes down to. Like there's a
Right.
lot of stuff that is difficult and painful and uncomfortable about operating your own business. It just is. And the ones that show up and do it anyway are, in my opinion, the leaders.
I love that answer. Just go ahead and lead through the hard things. That's what a real leader does. Man, this has been a great conversation, Doug, and I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge. I think there's so many shop owners listening that could get some value from this. So thank you, Doug.
Yeah, of course. Happy to do it, Daniel.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Before we let you go, where can people find you? Like, where should they go if they want to learn more about you or get in touch with you? What's the best way to contact you, Doug?
Yeah, so obviously my website, collisionadvisory.com, there's a dozen different ways on there that I've made it easy for everybody to
Right.
reach out to me on the website. Obviously, you'll see me on LinkedIn a lot. I'd like to
Right.
be out there and talking about some of these topics. So, and then I have recently started putting out a newsletter on LinkedIn on a monthly basis. So if people want to follow along, I'll be pushing that there. And then on the website, I put out a weekly email just pointing people to some of the stuff that I put out that week on various topics. So, but most of it exists on the website historically. So there's a bunch of,
Nice.
stuff on there that people can go and pull playbooks and calculators and all kinds of stuff to help them
Awesome.
run their business.
That is great. A great resource for people, it sounds like. All right. Well, that's going to be it for this episode of the Body Shop Leaders podcast. If you got value from today's conversation, make sure you subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with another shop owner that's needing to hear this. All right. Until next time, keep leading.